As you watch this video, you're going to want to make sure you fill out these notes, and at the very end of it, you're going to want to answer this final question before you're able to move on. So here we go. We are looking at the question, does technology always improve the lives of people in a society? Are there benefits and costs with that? And we have a fine example of that with the railroads coming into Kansas and helping develop the cattle industry. So again, are technological advances always beneficial to society or people? And specifically, to kind of help us answer that question, we have this one. Was the growth of the railroad into Kansas and the Great Plains beneficial or destructive? So we're going to be getting one perspective here in this lesson, and then you will be looking at another perspective after you finish this. So to kind of get us started, major piece that allowed Kansas to develop quickly after the Civil War was the expansion of the railroad. Essentially, the federal government wanted a transcontinental railroad that connected the west coast through California all the way to the east coast, where most of the population had already developed in the United States. That would help the west be settled and for industries and the economy of the United States to grow. And so in order to do that, they needed railroad companies to build the railroads. And so just like with the Homestead Act, they had to provide incentives to these railroad companies to build, because it was kind of guesswork whether or not it would pay off. So the federal government, in a way, tried to help them out, and I'm going to show you how that worked here. Just to kind of show you the expansion over time, we have everything from 1860 to today on this map. Really just want to focus from 1860 to 1890. But you see 1860, right when before the Civil War broke out, the railroads really hadn't expanded much past the Mississippi River. 1870, just the year before that, we had the Transcontinental Railroad, which was finished. You can see that one stray line that goes all the way out to the west, connecting to all the smaller ones in the eastern states. And then by 1880, more lines, especially you see through Kansas, developing, and 1890 even more so. Today, railroads obviously have drawn back because we have better forms of transportation. So the federal government, to try and encourage these railroad companies to expand west, passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which makes sense, Pacific Ocean on the west coast where they wanted it to get to. What they did was they would say to these companies, hey, we will give you land grants, meaning a grant is free. So we will provide you a bunch of land for free in certain places in the West as long as you build a railroad there. And in doing so, we will give you some of that land next to the railroad that you own. So the incentive to the railroad companies was two things there at the bottom. Once the road is built, they could then sell the land so they can make money from people coming in, because now there's a railroad there and they'll want to. And they also, the railroads, once the people are there, are going to make money shipping goods that they sell, especially farm goods that you learned about when we did the Homestead Act. So to try and get these companies to do this, the federal government said, hey, we will give you help by giving you free land that's yours to do with as you want, and you'll make money off of it once people come live out there. And they bought into it. Here you see the railroad grants. It kind of shows you at the bottom here how this worked out. There'd be a line that was cleared for the railroad company, and then on either side of that line there was land given to both the railroad companies, and the federal government controlled some of that as well. But being close to the railroads was attractive for people, as you found out in the simulation we did, and they would be able to sell it once people moved there. So to show you this again, you've seen this graph before. The railroads do help Kansas develop towns and its businesses. The railroads essentially determined where cities would develop, and we're going to see some of that with the cattle industry, because it allowed people to receive goods quickly and sell their goods quickly. And you see here, 1860, 107,000 people. As the railroad expands at the Transcontinental Railroad, 1870, 1880, it's almost to 1 million people in 1880. So the railroad definitely played a role here in helping settle the state. This map shows you, they look like highlighter marks, but what they are showing you all the federal land grants to railroads that were given. In Kansas, you see there's quite a bit all the way across Kansas, and roughly 1/6 of all the land in Kansas was given as free land to these railroad companies. So many people were not happy about this because it kind of gave the railroads a monopoly to operate however they wanted, and some people didn't see that as fair. But it's kind of hard to imagine what the progress of settlement would have been like without this government program in place to try and encourage these roads to get there, if people would have even settled out there, or as fast. So, as people come out here, as the railroads expand west, we have developed what's kind of known in history as the cattle kingdom. You see this picture down here is actually a longhorn cattle. If you know, like the Texas Longhorns, this is where this comes from. So, after the Civil War, the Spanish, when they came here, they were highly involved in the southern parts of the United States. They brought cattle with them. Cattle were not something native to the Americas. And so there were just a bunch of cattle roaming around freely, just wild on their own. And the people that lived down there didn't see any need to round them up or herd them in large numbers because they couldn't sell them effectively to other places, like the East Coast where people lived, because there was no way to get them there. You couldn't march them all the way to the East Coast. This changes, though, once the railroad comes through. So when the railroad came through Kansas, specifically, and parts of Missouri, what some of these ranchers in Texas said or thought was, well, now we have the opportunity to maybe sell some of these to the east, because there was a high demand for beef in the eastern states with little access to it, and they saw a need. And so what they decided to do was hire cowboys, and I know what you know of cowboys is, the shoot 'em up kind of people, but that is not the case. Cowboys literally herded cows from places like Texas to cow towns, which were towns that developed along the railroads. And in those towns, they had holding pens and stockyards. They would ship cattle on the railroads to the eastern markets to be sold and make a large profit off of it. To kind of show you some of this industry that developed in Kansas, these cow towns were money makers for many people. Specifically, like this man, Joseph McCoy, he developed the first cow town in what's known as Abilene, Kansas. He realized these cowboys, who really got paid quite well for doing the job they did, when they got to the railroads, they needed things to do. So he developed these towns, and he built hotels and saloons and bars, activities and entertainment for them to spend their money they had made while in town instead of getting in unstructured trouble. Other cities that we know of today, Dodge City and Wichita, they got their start as cow towns because other people saw the ability to make a lot of money off of this. And this is also the time period we get from those Western movies, where cowboys and Indians are fighting each other. But really, that was mostly just a myth that was developed. The most wild that things happened might have been a few gunfights that went on. And some towns did get rowdy enough in Kansas, like Dodge City, to actually ban the carrying of weapons. A lot of times these cowboys might spend their money on a fancy revolver, but not really know how to use it. And they might get drunk and go shoot their guns off in the middle of the town, but not nearly as crazy as the movies make you think. Another entrepreneur in Kansas that took advantage of the railroads and helped develop another industry and jobs in the state was Fred Harvey, who actually lived in Leavenworth. They have the house still. And what he realized was there was nowhere good to eat if you were traveling on the railroads. And so what he developed were the Harvey houses. These were essentially restaurants that were both at the train depots and later on serving cars on the trains themselves to serve food to the passengers. He also provided jobs to what was known as Harvey girls. You see them here in their uniforms, they all dressed the same, and so it was an opportunity for women to be employed as well. So the cattle industry didn't last forever, but at its height, as people saw that you could make a lot of money, you could purchase a cattle for $5 in Texas and sell it for a profit, $60 on the East Coast when they would end up. And so even though after all this trip of shipping them and getting them where they needed to be, you still made a big profit. However, there was a lot of overinvestment in this because people wanted to make money. And so by approaching the 1900s, there were over 7 million cattle in Texas. Unfortunately, it was too many for the natural environment to handle. Diseases started to spread between the cattle. In fact, Kansas passes a law that stops Texas cattle from entering into the state because of what was known as Texas fever that would kill off other herds. And as people started settling into the Great Plains, not just Kansas, but Oklahoma and Texas, these farmers started fencing off their land because they didn't want these cattle freely ranging over their property. And so it limited the ability for these cattle to get to market quickly and effectively. And also, with the railroad itself, while it gave rise to the cattle industry, also in the end killed the cattle industry in Kansas because the rail lines expanded later on into Texas, and so there was no need for these major cattle drives. The cattle industry was still a big thing, but in the state of Kansas, it kind of died out. So, something to keep in mind, we saw this one perspective, but if you remember way back when, we learned about Indian removal to Kansas. And so something I want you to think about before you move on to your next task here is, what about these Native Americans who were placed on these reservations you see on this map? Because if you would have seen on the map with the railroads came through here. So how did the railroad affect them?